All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started now. The shir was on the mitzvah number 92, according to the counting of the Sefer Chinuch, which was the mitzvah of not boiling a kid in her mother's milk, right? Basar v'chalev. We also looked at mitzvah. Not only is it a mitzvah not to boil, but also not to eat, obviously, and then also not to have any type of enjoyment. What I want to do now is sort of follow up on that mitzvah, also in mitzvah numbers 92 and 113, but really go in, but says with regards to this mitzvah. So the essence of the regards to meat and milk. And the meat we're talking about are, our traditional animals. We were talking about cow, pure animals, tahor animals, not tameh, and mixing it with cheese. That's what the prohibition. In mitzvah number 113, and that's the first source sheet, you'll notice that a little bit better next time. I just admitted people who are waiting. You'll notice that the Sefer Chinuch says there's I apologize. The Sefer in the bolded Hebrew, right? The essence of the mitzvah is that it's basar v'chalav, mina Torah, but it's behema Torah, a pure animal, avalo behema tameh, v'lo b'chaya, not a wild animal, right? We're only talking about domesticated animals. Afilu tahara, even if that wild animal was a pure animal, v'lo ba'of, and it doesn't have anything to do with chicken, whether or not it's a pure or tameh animal. In other words, the prohibition of mixing, right, boiling, does not apply to cooking chicken and milk. It does not apply to even benefiting from that mixture of chicken and milk. However, the Sefer Chinuch goes on to say, however, with regards to eating that, Asrum zichronim levracha, the Chazal prohibited that nevertheless, that you should not eat chicken and milk, but the other examples as well. But that's just, I think, a clear example. Chicken and cheese together, even though that's not the Torah prohibition. Why did they not do it? The fear was maybe people would substitute. They would see someone eating chicken and cheese, and they would think, oh, that's meat and cheese. They'd get confused, and they'd mix them together, the actual Torah prohibition, and would become a much more serious violation. Because the matter, lefichach mibnei hadavar karov shebasar, because chicken is close to meat, you might use it as a substitute. And hichmiru were more strict. Gam begeder, they created a fence, right? They created a fence to make sure that you don't come to the actual prohibition by extending the prohibition to include also to chicken and cheese. So the topic that I want to really talk about today is the topic of creating a fence. That's something that's very familiar to us all, that there is an actual Torah prohibition, and then there's the familiarity by adding to that prohibition, get close to the Torah prohibition. There's a lot of logic to that. If you go to the national parks, both here in Israel as well as throughout the world, they'll have a fence before you get to the cliff, right? The thing that they're really trying to fall over the cliff. But they'll create a fence before the cliff, so you never get into the danger. It's something that's quite logical, we understand. And in Judaism, a strong tradition in the rabbinic world. If I'm sharing the screen with you, you go to the very last source, the very last page, or the second to last page, Pirkei Avot, something we're all familiar with. The very first Pirkei Avot, Sinai. Right? This is the introduction to the ethical teachings of the rabbis. It speaks first about transmission, that Moshe received it from Sinai and then gives it over. Eventually, it gets to the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, and they said three things. This is the introduction to all of Pirkei Avot, presumably the most foundational messages we could have, right? And they say, "Tunim bedin," you should be deliberate in your judgment. You should be very careful, exacting when you make judgments. Va'amidu talmidim habe, and you shall raise many students. V'asu sayag l'Torah, and create a fence around the Torah. Those three things are incredibly important, and they're foundational, presumably by being the very first in Pirkei Avot. So, the idea of creating a fence around the Torah seems very, very common. I'm now going back up to the first page. By the way, those of you on Zoom, if you came a little later, I apologize. I have no idea why there's a Ben & Jerry's picture behind my head. One of my kids apparently has done that. So, source, just to give you an idea of how familiar or how common the concept of creating a fence around the Torah is. The very first Mishnah, all right, we just saw the very first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Now the very first Mishnah of Brachot, which is the very first tractate of the entire Mishnah, the entire Talmud. This is what we're going to learn at the very beginning. It too begins with the lesson of creating a fence around the Torah. Right? Eimatai, Korinet Shema Ba'aravit. When do we begin reciting the Shema in the evening? And then it gives a few different answers. The Chachamim give that you have to make sure to say Shema. That's when you have to finish Kriyat Shema. But then there's a story that takes place. Rabban Gamliel has his children come home from a wedding one night. They're too late. It's past Chatzot. They talk to him, and he says, you still can say it. In fact, you're still obligated to say it. The mitzvah is actually to say it until morning dawn. And he says, every time Chatzot, every time the Chazal say, until is an obligation actually until the very morning. So why did they then say that? I'm sorry? Okay. Why did they say that? If the essence of the mitzvah is until Chatzot, why is it that if the essence of the mitzvah is until the morning, why did the rabbis then say, no, but do it before Chatzot? Right? It's almost a form of lying. The answer is to keep people far from transgressing. The image we have of creating a fence before you fall off the cliff. And if you just want to see how clearly this is embedded, that first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is embedded in this thinking in the first Mishnah in Brachot. Yishmael gives a similar case. This has to do with the Karban Pesach, of when you have to finish eating it. It says, the next source, it says it's very similar. It's till Chatzot, but really it's until Alot HaShachar. So you'll see at the end of the first line, Upnei ma amru ad Chatzot. So why did they then say until Chatzot? Today, the exact same brachot, La'achik adam min ha'avira, far from transgression. Here the Mechilta adds words. This was really the kavana of the rabbis in that Mishnah and Brachot. He tells us explicitly, Lasot sayag l'Torah. They did it to create a fence around the Torah. It's the exact same language we have from Pirkei Avot. L'kayim divrei anshe knesset ha'gedolah, in order to fulfill the words of the men of the Great Assembly, right? It's actually the reason why they said Chatzot is specifically to fulfill that idea. And then they say the three things, that you shall be deliberate in your judgment, midu tamidim habe, and you shall stand up, create many students, v'asusayag l'Torah, and create a fence around the Torah. So it's very clear that this is a common principle, and I could give you many, many sources. One of the later sources is the Minchat Chinuch, and he gives us a whole series of places where the concept of creating a fence around the Torah appears in the Gemara. By the way, just before going on, it's a technical question. On this Mechilta, when he says, he quotes the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the Pirkei Avot, the only thing he wants to teach us is the Asusayag the Torah, that they created a fence around the Torah. Why does he include the entire teaching of be deliberate in your judgment and also raise many students? You could say that he's just doing the long form, although what I'd like to suggest is actually all three of these are intimately connected to the concept of Sayag of the Torah, and will hopefully give us a deeper meaning of this entire concept of creating a fence around the Torah. So let's now talk a little bit more about this concept of creating a fence around the Torah. If you go a little further down, you'll see that this concept of creating a fence around the Torah is not just a rabbinic idea. It actually has the full weight of the Torah itself. When the rabbis create a fence around the Torah, that then becomes the law. Right? It's not a suggestion. The fence that's before the cliff in the national park, just crossing it, that becomes a violation of the law. So too here, crossing the fence that the rabbis create is a violation of the law itself. It's not just to help protect the Torah, it becomes law itself. And the source of that is from Devarim. I have the English for you in the next source. If a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, assault, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place the Lord God has chosen, this is the great Sanhedrin, and appear before the priests or the magistrate in charge at the time and present your problem. When they have announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from the place that the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all of the instructions that they Yorucha. I'm just getting a notice that there's some problem with my computer. Hopefully you heard that. That you shall follow all of their instructions. Al pi Torah, you shall act in accordance with the instructions given you by the ruling handed down to you by these rabbis. You must not deviate to the right or to the left. And the Hebrew, lo tasur min hadavar. You shall not turn away. You shall not deviate at all. That's a right to prohibition of not deviating from the words of the rabbis. And what we see as we go forward is if the rabbis say that we need this fence, that becomes, even though it's a rabbinic statement, we need to add this additional fence around the Torah. Because of this verse in Dvarim, what they then say, which was rabbinic, becomes the right in and of itself. Because we have a Torah obligation not to disobey the rabbis. The Rambam, in fact, brings both of those verses down in his Sefer Mitzvot as two separate mitzvot, one a positive and one a negative. You see it just below. Lishmo mikol beit din hagadol. You have to listen to every great beit din. What do they say? Because you have to listen to what they say. And then you also can't rebel against the beit din. Don't turn away, don't deviate. In Dvarim, the Sefer Chinuch brings it down also as two mitzvot. Mitzvot 495 and numbers 496. He starts off to listen to the voice of the court at all times, to listen to the great court and do all that they command. And then he says there's no difference whether or not it's coming from their learning of the Torah text, and that's why they make a certain judgment, or if it's their own intellect. If their own intellect says this is what we need to do, that also then becomes a law of the Torah. I'll continue further going down. It then talks a little bit about, well, how you deal with disagreements. In general, you have to follow the courts that came before you. But if you, in a different generation, have a greater court that's greater in wisdom or greater in the number of adherents it has, then you have the ability to overturn what a previous rabbinic court decided, says the Sefer Chinuch. However, he makes a very interesting caveat which will be important for us, and we're going to come back to this idea a lot because it's going to, I think, explain what the fence around the Torah really is all about. I don't think it's just about us from violating the Torah. It's actually a principled point that the rabbis are trying to teach us. If you go to the bolded words, and about what are the words we're speaking of?
The Bible is great, but it wants it.
I'm sorry, I can't.
That's the problem. It's not, I can't understand it.
I'm sorry, I can't. Who's speaking?
It's like an echo. Whatever you want. Yeah.
Is someone speaking? I can't hear. Someone have a question? Okay. Okay. So if you see the bolded print, The bolded word says, what are we talking about when a later court can revoke an earlier court if it's greater in wisdom, if it's greater in numbers? When the earlier court did not forbid the thing, the fence around. In other words, here's an amazing idea. If the rabbis of a previous generation say, this is the halacha, this is our understanding of the halacha, this is a deraita, and then the current generation, there's a court that's greater in wisdom and greater in numbers, says they had it wrong, you can revoke the previous court's decision. But if the previous court's decision was not saying this is what the Torah says, but rather saying this is a fence around the Torah that we're creating, we know that it's not the actual Torah. It's the actual halacha. But it's our suggestion of how to keep the Torah that you can't actually change. Now that to me is a radical statement. It's almost as if it's suggesting the fence around the Torah is more kodesh than what might be an actual. And the Sefer Chinuch says that breaching of the fence is even more problematic. He ends by saying, and one who breaches the fence, he doesn't finish the sentence, so I bring Kohelet with you. Kohelet actually finished the sentence. One who breaches a stone fence will be bitten by a snake. And Rashi on that verse says, the Frotz Geder, the person who breaks a fence. Sorry, let's see, I'm going to remind everyone to mute.
You're at the gym, Kevin. You need to get out here too. That's right. Me too. Wait for me.
All right.
Kevin are off. What a relief that is. See you tomorrow, school baby. Oh yeah. Hey, wait up, guys. What's wrong, Kevin?
Okay. It seems we're.
Oh, Scooby.
Sorry. Didn't see your belt get caught. Are you okay? Hey guys, get out!
It looks like we may have been. It looks like we. Yeah, I'm trying to mute everyone, but I think it's possible that we've been bombed by someone also. Let's see what I can do. I'm going to end the meeting temporarily and then come back on. Okay? And then let's see if I could try to do this.
But I didn't see the car coming, Polly.
That's my point. You didn't.
Okay, I still have it. I've muted everyone, so it must be that we've been bombed.
You want us to log out?
So
You want us to log out?
yeah, everyone log out and log back in. I apologize. It looks like we've been attacked.
After you get off the bus, never run around the front.
Sorry, those of you who are on Facebook, I apologize. On Zoom, apparently we had someone who bombed our class, and we couldn't quiet them down. So I had to go off, and now everyone is going to hopefully sign back on. And so it will just take a moment. If anyone wants to raise a question on Facebook in the meantime, please by all means do so, and I will do my best to answer it. Yes, hi Mimi. It's the first time at a Zoom bomb, right? That's great. It means we're going up in the world, I guess. Let's see. Right. So you heard the kids show. That was true. I got a little nervous. It sounded like something my kid was watching. I apologize. I'm having a tough time here now. Let's see. I see your question about PMing you the Zoom link. I'm just not sure I would be able to find it. Let's see. I'm having a tough time just getting onto my Zoom link. Oh, here's. Let's try to host our meeting. If you go to the recent announcements, they're actually also on Shir Chadash's Facebook page, not the group, but the Facebook page. You will also be able to see a link to the announcements that then has a link to the Zoom. Anyway, hope you on Facebook will just stay with me for another moment. We are back, I think, in Zoom now, and so here we go. Okay. Okay. Hi, Simone. I see you. Hi, Nadia. I think that's the right suggestion, is that we should just continue on the Facebook, because the Zoom doesn't seem to, let's see, I'll try one more time to be able to see what we can do. Here we go. Okay. All right. I apologize to those who are on Zoom. It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to get that on so easily. Yeah. So I'm going to do Facebook now, and I will send my apologies to the Zoom group. I see. It says the meeting is now over. Okay. I apologize for that interruption. Let's get back going. By the way, I should mention that all of these classes, for those of you who have missed, and I'll send this to those who are on Zoom, all of these classes are also taped and uploaded to our YouTube channel, which will also appear on our website, which we've been working on. But you can see them in case you miss anything along the way. ShirChadashJerusalem.com, that's the website. And if you go to the Torah, you'll then see all of the different videos that are given, not just by me, but by our Daf Yomi and anyone else who gives through the Facebook Live platform. Okay, just as a quick review, as much for myself as for you, talking about the concept of creating a fence around the Torah. The rabbis teach us that it's not just a good advice, but it becomes law in and of itself. We learned this originally from Basar V'Chalav, but the truth of the matter is, it's throughout the entire Torah. We have it in Pirkei Avot, of course, creating a fence around the Torah. It's based also on the Torah in Dvarim that says, Lo tasu, don't deviate from the words of the rabbis, giving their words a Torah obligation to what they have to say, and extra power to those words that have to do with creating a fence. Rabbis can change previous rabbis' conclusions on a lot of matters, but not specifically when it comes to creating fences around the Torah. So that's the quick review, and that also brings us to just maybe a pause in what we were talking about and connecting to the concept of why should we have a fence around the Torah at all. I'll give you one good example right now. My son is now crying. And if I had locked the door beforehand, perhaps I would have prevented him from also trying to sort of bomb our class here. Excuse me for one moment as I shut the door. Okay. I guess another commercial I should offer is that I think some of the shiurim are going to start back in the shul, which will make life a little bit easier as well, and I'll update you on those things as well. Okay, so I want to just talk outside of the world of Torah for a moment. Why does it make sense to create a fence around the Torah? And if anyone also wants to join in and give some suggestions, I'll be happy to see those as well. I see Nadia. Thank you about need help with the Zoom. I probably do, but you know what? I'd rather just go forward with the class and finish it rather than going back and forth at this point in time. So the one of the reasons I think certainly that makes sense. We spoke about already just the idea of preventing someone from getting to a more serious situation by having a less serious prohibition. There's a certain logic to this idea. Someone wrote a book. It's called The One Thing. I have it here. It's a best-selling business book. And anyway, one of the things he writes is he argues that many people believe that to be a very successful in a lot of different things, you have to live a very disciplined life. You always have to have the ability to express your willpower, to control your temptations, your desires, to always do the right thing. And he says it's not really true. You don't always have to have willpower. He says you have to have very specified willpower, limited willpower, I would even suggest. What is limited willpower? You have to have it at the right time and work on it at the right time. Facebook's cutting in and out. So sorry to hear this. I think we're going to all enjoy when we go back to live in-person shiurim. So one of the things he argues is, I hear this crying, so it's hard to do it, but his mother's with him. So one of the things he argues about being disciplined is you need to be disciplined at the right time and for a limited period of time. And what he calls that is the time of developing your habits, right? You don't have to always be disciplined to say no to something, but rather you need to be able to be disciplined enough, long enough to create a habit, to create a routine, a habit. And then once you have that habit, the habit takes over and you no longer need to express your discipline. I see a parallel to a certain extent. With this idea of the fence and the Torah itself. That sometimes the fence is easier to do, and if you do it enough, you will never get to the challenge of having to deal with the Torah. Think about, for example, buying potato chips, right? So if you have potato chips in your house, the temptation exists, and you need a lot of willpower not to eat those potato chips. And the way willpower often works is you'll do your best the first time, second time, third time, but by the fourth time you're tired and you're weak and you're this and you need something salty and you eat the potato chips. But to have the willpower at the supermarket, that's hopefully not going there hungry, but to have the willpower in the beginning just not to buy them, right? So that's much easier. And I think there's a parallel there of perhaps the fence is something that's easier to deal with, to have your willpower at that moment, and therefore then you never get to the more serious concern as well. There is, I think, another sort of practical example. One of my favorite books is a book called Nudge by Cass Sunstein. And in it, he describes something called choice architecture. And choice architecture basically is the idea that you can create environments that help you achieve the goals you want to achieve. And one of my favorite examples in that book is a cafeteria in Chicago. And they noticed that people were wasting a tremendous amount of their food. I think it was more than 50% of the food that they would do, they were wasting. And one of the reasons why they noticed is people would take these big trays, and then they, of course, would put their plate on top of the trays, and then they would also put additional food on the tray itself. You know, they'd put an apple here, and a cake here, and a drink here, and they filled up their whole trays. And it was, you know, in a college where you could go back and forth in the cafeteria as much as you wanted. And they noticed that people wasted a lot of food. And so they did something very simple. They just removed the tray. They gave you a plate, and they said you can come back as many times as you want. We're not limiting the amount of food you take, but we are saying the form with which you take it, you can't take a tray. So people would take their plate, and the truth is they could go back for more food, but they decided not to. And the amount of waste dropped tremendously. Also, the amount of food that was actually eaten dropped tremendously. But the amount of waste also dropped. And the architecture of their choices is what accomplished that goal. What you see here, again, the Torah in this sense, I think, is the goal of not wasting. The fence was, let's remove the tray. Let's make it easier for people to fulfill the Torah without limiting their freedom too significantly. And I think that's what a lot of the creating fences around the Torah are trying to do, is to help us along that path. So I think that's some of the just, what I would say, logical explanations of what we could do. I should also point out that this is not just a Jewish law idea. This is a secular United States law. Does this all the time. They call it a prophylactic law. A prophylactic law is a law that protects the Constitution, protects a constitutional law that we're afraid might be trampled upon if they don't have some additional protections. What's the classic case of a prophylactic law that protects a constitutional right? Something I'm sure we're all familiar with. Certainly if you watch any type of procedural legal shows, the Miranda rights, right? You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. All those rights. Where does that come from? So there was a case, Miranda versus Arizona. In that, the argument was made that the person being arrested didn't understand that they had a right not to confess. The fifth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution is the right not to incriminate yourself. Okay, that's the constitutional right. The judges, when they explored this case, they said, well, that's a constitutional right, but not everyone knows about having that right. So we think that cops, police officers, should tell people that they have the right and they have the right to attorney, and they don't have to confess, because maybe their confession was against their constitutional right not to incriminate themselves. And so the judges themselves wrote the prophylactic rule. They wrote the rule of the exact phraseology that the police had to now say. Now, you could say, why did they have to get so specific, right? You could go every single case that comes along on a case-by-case basis. You know, the police officer yelled at me. That's coercion. Throw it out. Throw out the confession because it's a violation of his constitutional right. The police officer beat me. That's certainly a violation of the Fifth Amendment right, and that's a coercion. But what happens if the police officer simply looked mean at me? Is that also a violation? What happens if the police officer had his tooth pulled early in the day? He wasn't trying to intimidate me, but he just looked upset. So the judges said, we're not going to deal with every specific case. And I think they did so for two reasons. We're going to create a prophylactic law. We're going to create the Miranda rights that you're going to read out to every single person, and there's going to be a presumption that if that person doesn't get those rights read to them, the presumption is that their constitutional rights were violated, even though in many cases they won't have been. Right? There are many cases where the person confesses all right away, but it doesn't matter. We're going to give the presumption in this case. And I think the judges did so for two reasons, both of which are going to come back and I think be relatively important for us. One of them has to do with the concept, a practical concept. You can't litigate and you can't adjudicate every single possible case that there is. There's so many billions of people in this world, and you just don't have enough judges to have everyone come in front of you and explain this particular unique case, this particular unique case. There's just not enough time for that. So you have to create a prophylactic law that covers everything, as many people as possible, to give as many people as possible a certain amount of fairness. And the second, I think that's very important here, is the reason why they do it also is for an issue of equality, that everyone is going to be created equally. There's not going to be one law for this person and one law for that person, that we're going to adjudicate differently for different people. Just as a digression, when Bibi had his son over for Seder, right? People got upset. They weren't upset about the Torah. The Torah is we have to stop the spread of the coronavirus, right? People weren't really concerned that there was going to be a spread of corona because Bibi had his son over for Seder. They were upset that there was a lack of equality in the law, that Bibi made a decision of what would be safe and what would not be safe. He took law into his own hands, and he basically said, I know better in this case. And therefore, people were not treated equally before the law, because everyone else had to follow what the law is. That's the interesting thing about these prophylactic laws. The judges say that our prophylactic law is law itself. Because if you don't do that, it has no legitimacy. If you simply say, well, there's this constitutional law that's very important, but our concern of protecting it is less important. You can decide whether or not you like our suggestions or not. So then there's no legitimacy. That's what got people so upset. The rabbis do the same thing. They say, if we look at the lo tasur concept, the rabbis say, this is law. This becomes a deraita. It's not up to you to decide. There's an equality in that. It's not up to you to decide. Everyone has to be along the same path. And I'd like to develop this idea a little bit more, because I think it's the essential element of what we're talking about when we say it's important to create a fence around the Torah. I could just say also, derech hagav, there are other ways that the Supreme Court's decisions, and Miranda is parallel to the rabbinic understanding. They're trying to keep the law alive, right? The more you interpret law, the more you keep it alive. Certainly that's a concept in Torah. Our oral law interprets our written law, and we keep it alive in every generation. Today, more people are studying Torah than ever before. It's very rare to have a book a few thousand years old that is constantly being discussed, but it's being discussed within Judaism because there is a constant discussion and interpretation of how it should be applied. And that's what the court is trying to do with the Constitution, and of course that's what the rabbis are doing with the Torah. Okay, let me now develop the point a little bit that I was saying about the concept of equality. When you create a fence, it kind of treats everyone equal. We don't look at unique cases and say, well, because you're the prime minister, you don't need the fence, and you, Joe Schmo, you do need the fence, because we are really concerned that it might get to the stage. And I gave two issues. One is the issue of equality, and the one other issue is the practical nature of that. Actually, in the source sheet, I brought a University of Chicago Law Review article. We don't need to go over it, but if you want to follow along, you can look at it, and you'll see where I talk a little bit about the court's concern of just the impracticability of litigating, adjudicating every single case. Now, in order to make the point or develop the point that I want to go to, I want to point out that everything I've said up until now about creating a fence around the Torah has been relatively positive, or at least that there's a positive explanation or element to it. But there's also, I would say, a negative side to creating a fence around the Torah. And the rabbis themselves were very concerned about creating a fence around the Torah, what negative impact it might have. And there's the next source. In Dvarim, chapter 13. Everything that I have commanded you today, Tishmaru, you shall keep, Lasot, you shall do it, Lo tosif alav, v'lo tigra mimenu. You shall not add to the Torah, and you shall not diminish from the Torah. The rabbis learn from this statement, not that you shall not add nor diminish, but very often if you add, Tosif, if you add to a law, you often diminish from the fulfillment of that law. And the famous case of that appears in the Gemara on Daf 29, Amud Aleph. And you see that's the source right below. Right? Amud Cheskia, Minayin Shekola Mosif Goreya. Where do we know? What's the source of whoever adds to the Torah, actually detracts or subtracts from the Torah? And then he quotes the Gemara, the Torah in Breshit, Amar Elohim, Lo tochlu mimeno v'lo tigubo. That's the famous case of Adam and Eve. And you see the source developed a little bit before, a little bit more below. It is derived from the verse where it's stated that Eve said, Eve now telling Adam, God has said, you shall not eat from it, neither shall you touch it. Whereas God actually only says, you shall not eat from the tree. He never said anything about not touching from it. And the snake and Eve get into this discussion. And the snake tricks Eve. And he then pushes her, and she touches it, and nothing happens. So Eve added this extra restriction, right? There's a restriction, don't eat. But she added something extra. She added a chumrah, don't even touch it. You might think that's normally a positive thing. She created a fence around the Torah. Right? Obviously, if you don't touch it, you're not going to eat it. Sounds like a beautiful idea. But because of that, the snake was able to take advantage of it and convince her that it's not even worth keeping the real mitzvah. And so we see the exact opposite. And this, by the way, of course, is the beginning of the whole Torah. We see the exact opposite, where someone tried to create a chumrah, someone tried to create a fence around the Torah, and one accomplished the exact opposite. That this is part of the first sin. And a lot we can understand this idea by understanding the concept of chumrah in general. Before I get to that, let me just add two caveats. Those are the sources below. Not everyone agrees with this negativity about creating a fence around the Torah as a principled idea. Kol hamosif. Whoever adds actually detracts. The next two sources, for example, give other examples in the Torah where we learn about this concept. Whoever adds actually subtracts, but in a very technical way, meaning not anything that you have to learn a principled opposition to the concept. You see the source, the next source, Meir Shariah, says that the idea of one who adds, subtracts, can also be proven from here. 2 cubits, amatayim, and a half shall be its length, in describing the building of the Mishkan. Without the letter Aleph, amatayim is Aleph, mem, tough. If you take away the Aleph, right, you then have the word matayim, which means 200. So by adding the Aleph, you actually reduced the size from matayim, 200, to only 2. Okay, amatayim. So that's a technical answer. It says kol mosif. In this case, when you add, you subtract, but there's no real principle at stake here. It's just learning out in that regard. And the next one is the exact same idea. The word ashtei esrei. If you remove the ayin, then you get shtei esrei. So you go down there as well. You added an extra letter, and you actually go down from 12 to 11. Okay, nothing overly inspirational here, but just pointing out that some people don't want to learn the negative possibilities of adding, creating a fence of the Torah, that there will be a negativity there. And I should point out that Rabbi Hananel, who you see on the side of the Gemara, he summarizes the Gemara and sort of just hits the high points, those things that are most important. He actually leaves out the first one. The Kol HaMosif is connected to Adam v'Chava and the snake. He doesn't even mention that at all. So he too seems to suggest that's the case. But let's assume that there are some rabbis, as there obviously are, who view there's a negativity in adding. And I think the concept of the chumrah is a good way of helping to understand that concept. Right? Chumrah in general is a positive thing. I'm doing something holier when it's done privately. Right? When I'm adding strictures to my life as a way of honoring God, so there's something that could be very positive about that. Chumrah, however, becomes usually a negative when you publicize it and when it affects other people. When I say I can't eat with you because you're at a lower level of kashrut than me, so then that's a negativity. Rabbi Fink once gave a beautiful shir about how there were rabbis sitting around a wedding table, And there were some great Talmidei Chachamim, and there was a younger guy who said when they brought out the food, he says, I can't eat this. And he says there's a big problem with that. It embarrasses the rabbis who are there, who are these great Talmidei Chachamim, and there creates a friction there. And also, he points out, Moshe Feinstein says something similar, certain chumrot can be a disgrace to previous generations, meaning if something was okay for previous generations, and now you say it's not okay, so there's something disrespectful in that regard. That's why if it's done privately, a chumrah will be positive, but once it affects something, there could be a potential negative element to it. And that's, I think, part of the concept of where I want to get to with this concept of a fence around the Torah. It's actually about connecting to a greater number of people in a positive way. Let's just look at the next source, because I think that's where we begin to see some of these ideas more clearly. If you look at the Rambam in Hilchot Mamrim, when does the above apply? Remember, we were previously about how different generations of different courts can overturn the previous courts if they're greater in number and greater in wisdom. So he's talking about when there are certain cases when you can overturn previous judges or not, decisions. When does this apply? With regard to matters that were not forbidden to create a safeguard for the words of Torah. Again, we saw this with the Sefer Chinuch. It applies if it's not dealing with a fence around the Torah. But as we asked, why is a fence around the Torah more severe and needs to be more protected than the Torah itself? Some instances the rabbis can disregard an interpretation of previous courts, but here, if they said that it was because of an offense, you're not allowed to do so. A different principle applies, by contrast, with regard to matters that which the court thought necessary to issue a decree and create a prohibition as a safeguard, the fence. If the prohibition spread throughout the people, another Supreme Sanhedrin does not have the authority to uproot the decree and grant license, even if it was a greater stature of the original court. Here we see an additional idea. It's not simply that they created a fence around the Torah and therefore that has to be protected. They created a fence around the Torah that was accepted by the masses. It spread throughout the Jewish people. There's something here about Amcha that makes the fence actually of greater importance. A court, of course, can suspend the application of such decrees temporarily, even if it is of a lesser stature than the original court. What is implied? If a court sees that it is necessary to strengthen the faith and create a safeguard so that the people will not violate Torah law, they may apply beatings and punishments that were not sanctioned by the Torah. They may do so, but they may not, however, establish the matter for posterity and say this is halacha. They're allowed to make changes, but only if it's for the benefit of that current generation. Similarly, if they saw that temporarily it was necessary to nullify a positive commandment or violate a negative commandment in order to bring people at large back to the Jewish faith or to prevent many Jews from transgressing in other matters, they may do whatever is necessary at the time. In other words, the only thing that can break the fence around the Torah of a decision of a previous generation is if you see that this current generation needs assistance. Right? The factor is not the fence, is the needs of the masses. That's what the Rambam is getting at here. He says it even more explicitly below. When a court sees that it's necessary to issue a decree, institute an edict, establish a custom, they want to do something that's outside of the literal nature of Torah itself, they must first contemplate the matter and see whether or not the majority of the community can uphold the practice. That's the determining factor. By the way, you go to the next case. If a court issued a decree thinking the majority of the community could uphold it, and after the decree was issued, the majority of the community raised contentions and the practice did not spread throughout the majority of the community, the decree is nullified. You can get rid of a fence around the Torah if people can't keep it, or if people reject it. We think this is sort of rabbinic autonomy that's taking place here with creating a fence around the Torah. But there is a consensual element of the entire people. That the people accept these safeguards becomes the motivating force. Not the rabbinic power, but rather the people power, if you will. The Minchas Chinuch that I bring below, just I think is an interesting interpretation. If you remember, we started off, or we spoke a little bit a while ago, about the negative element of creating a fence around the Torah, and we had the story in Breshit, and Adam, and Chava, and the like. So the Minchas Chinuch helps justify the Rambam. The Rambam says that there was a sin involved, and there is a negative element to what Chava did. But the problem is not that a fence was created, not that she said don't touch it in order to get to the stage of not eating it. That would have been okay, so long as it was clear that this is not a direct Torah concern. In other words, says the Rambam, says the Minchas Chinuch, if Chava says to Adam, we're not allowed to eat the fruit of the tree, and in order to make sure we don't eat from the fruit of the tree, God said, if God in fact had said, God says, don't even touch it. That would have been okay. In other words, it's okay to create the fence so long as you're honest about it. As long as you're honest about saying, this is the right to law, and is the fence instituted to help us protect the right to law. As long as you don't say that this is the Torah itself, then it would be okay. As a way of justifying what I said was a negative in the fence, maybe there's a positive element as well. It says the Minchas Chinuch, I should just point out, is again, Derech Agav, the Ravid says, you don't even have to do that. The rabbis have the right to create Torah. It says, Shmartim, Shmartim, you keep my words of the rabbis, it becomes Torah in and of itself. Okay. Where's all of this leading us? What is the deeper point of creating a fence around the Torah? So, I brought the poem of Robert Frost. Many of you perhaps can see it on the Facebook page. And the poem is something we're familiar with, I think, of mending fences, right? The story goes every single year, the fence that divides the property of two neighbors gets worn down a little bit, and so they set a certain day where they come and they fix it. And the neighbor says, good fences make good neighbors. And I think that's the lesson most people always derive from this poem. But if you read the poem carefully, the narrator is actually against creating good fences. He says, what do we need these fences for? I have apple trees, you have pine trees. We don't have cows that are going to go cross one another. The trees are not going to cross one another. What do we actually need the fence for? And before I would build a fence, I'd be concerned of who is it going to offend, trying to keep out. That's one of the dangers I think a fence around the Torah is all about. Is that when you create a fence, Shlomo Carmach has a beautiful idea about Ne'ilah. He says the locking of the doors, right? We think that we're going to be locked out. Shlomo Carmach says, no, it's a different perspective. When it comes to Ne'ilah, we're going to be locked in. And we're excited by that possibility of being locked in this very great moment. So I'd say you also have to change your perspective and realize when you create a fence around the Torah, there are two possible things that are taking place. You're protecting the Torah, but you're also keeping people away from the Torah. If you create such a high barrier for Torah that it's not accessible to the common person, so you're keeping people out and you're actually diminishing Torah in that regard. That's the great danger of fences around the Torah. I want to give you, I think, a fascinating story that makes this case in real time, in our present time, and then tie it together with Pirkei Avot, the way I think we're really supposed to learn that initial Pirkei Avot statement. The story is about this guy named General Leonard Chapman. He was a real soldier, a general in the Marine Corps. They said when he left Vietnam, they had to leave, relatively instantly. They weren't very successful, of course. They said that you have to take anything back that's worth $50 or more. He said, we're taking everything back, even if it's just $5. And he said, we're going to leave our bases as if it's ready for inspection, as clean as can be. We're not going to just abandon. He was very disappointed. He was given the role of trying to build a fence, a wall, between North and South Vietnam. It was a border fight, right, to keep people separate. And it was determined that it couldn't be done. And he came back, and he then got higher and higher promotions, became a very important general, became a commandant of the Marine Corps. When he retired, and he retired at a very prestigious position, he asked to stay in government, and he wanted to take over the role of INS, Immigration and Natural Services. It was not a very important office in those days. And the reason why he was prepared to take, you can kind of get a sense, this demotion, was because he wasn't able to create a wall and create a border when he was charged with before, and he felt that's what we have to now do. This is many, many years ago. And he changed the Immigration and Natural Services policies. It used to be sort of a backwater office. There was very little patrolling of the border between the United States and Mexico at all. There are these great sociological studies, I think done by a guy named Doug Massey. 30 years he interviewed Mexicans who came back and forth, back and forth. And one of the things he noticed is that there were millions of Mexicans who would migrate to the United States for seasonal work. But there are also millions of Mexicans who went back home every single year. They went back home because they came to America to make some money, but their families were back home. Their culture was back home. They didn't have a desire to actually settle in the United States. And so the vast majority of Mexicans who came to the United States actually returned. They did not become permanent immigrants. And part of that, he argues, is because the cost of crossing the border was very, very low. He tells stories of people who lived in Juarez, who just basically viewed that it was one city. There's a Mexican city south of the river and an American city north of the river. But it was really one city, just two different parts. And he says every morning he would swim across the river with his friends, and they would sell watermelon, and then they would go back across the river at night. And this happened to family after family. There were many people who would cross, they'd come for a very short period of time, and then they'd go back. And so there was this incredible amount of people coming back and forth because the cost of coming back and forth was very, very low. So when something's free, you take advantage of it. So General Chapman steps in, and with good intentions, says we have to stop all this coming back and forth. And he started putting more patrols and creating laws and encouraging an observance of what was taking place. And the cost of crossing became much higher because now when you crossed, if you wanted to get back, it wasn't so easy to get back. And if you did get back to Mexico, you may never be able to get back into the United States. The major points of crossing became heavily militarized. And as a result, you would go hundreds of miles away from the easy crossings, and you would be in the middle of the desert, and you'd have to hire people to help smuggle you in. It became much more expensive, it became much more dangerous, it became much more risky on the United States side. You'd get arrested, you could have all these problems there. You could never see your family again in Mexico. So all of a sudden you started bringing in your family, and you stopped going back to Mexico. The cost was just too high to go back and forth. And so Malcolm Gladwell, who tells the story of General Chapman, says the exact opposite of his intention was fulfilled. Immigration actually went up from illegal immigration from Mexico to the United States, and the number of people who returned went incredibly down. The analysis was if you did absolutely nothing, you'd have about a third less immigrants as a result, illegal immigrants that came into the United States. So creating a wall, creating a fence, created a problem. It created a high cost. It limited the people who can gain access. And that then became a problem. And I'd like to suggest there's a parallel here, an important parallel, when it comes to understanding the nature of Torah. You see, go to Pirkei Avot again. I said there's three elements to the statement, right? Be diligent, be deliberate in your decision-making process, raise up many students, and create a fence around the Torah. I would like to suggest these three ideas are actually together. The goal that Torah wants from all of us is that we should be deliberate in our judgments. We should be serious students. We should learn lots of Torah. We don't need any outside inspiration. It should be internal inspiration for us. And if we take the specific case of basar v'chalav, of meat and dairy, we should never get to the stage. We understand the laws. We know that you can have technically chicken and cheese, but knowing that will never get us to the stage where we, God forbid, violate the Torah prohibition of eating meat and cheese or any other of these fences around the Torah. We don't need any of them. Right? If you're an elite individual, if you understand the laws of Torah, if you're learning yeshiva all day, you don't need the fence around the Torah. You're going to keep the Torah with self-motivation. You don't need any outside laws. However, not everyone can be elite. Not everyone can learn in yeshiva all day. It's not possible. So then the rabbis have a dilemma. Who should carry the banner of the Jewish people? Should it be just the elite? And the rabbis say no. That's the second statement. The second statement is, even though it's an ideal to strive for, Hamidu harbe studentim, tamidim. You should have as many students as possible. Now, once you have as many students as possible, the quality of each student probably goes down. Right? That's the very last source on the source sheet. Sorry. After Pirkei Avot, it says, this is the very last source, Hora'ahi lemorim or leomdim barosh marachot limud v'horah. This is a message to those who have educational institutions. Could go in Beit Sefer or Beit Midrash, school, yeshiva. Kol mi shepetech et latot batei sefer batei midrash levracha mistaken beknisat talmidim chalashim. When you open up these schools, very often you want to keep out weak students, filter them out. Or because they're not qualified to learn. They can't be the elite. The Chora Kadai Hayalo, that the Ot Al Kankano shall kol tamid kodem shikarev oto the olam halimud. Before they come and enter the world of Torah, you should check in what's inside of them. You should test them. And if they're not of the right quality, they can't remember well enough, they can't learn well enough, they don't know Hebrew well enough, they're not committed enough, they're not serious enough, you shouldn't allow them to come and enter the walls of the Beit Midrash. That seems logical. And just take those who can be the most successful. But what we've just learned in Pirkei Avot, the very first Pirkei Avot, the foundational Pirkei Avot, Ma'adif et hakamot. It's better to have the numbers. It's better to have as many students as possible. Gam b'makom shehi mitnageshet im ha'ichut. Even if that means you're not going to have a high quality. V'akol kedei lahagdil Torah b'Yisrael. That's how you increase the greatness of Torah in Israel. It's to increase the number of people who have access to Torah. So if we go back to the initial case of meat and milk and chicken and milk, if you're an elite member, you don't need any fence around the Torah. In fact, it's bothersome to you, right? I don't need this. Why are you limiting my freedom? Right? If you're a great rock climber, what do you want a fence in front of the cliff? It bothers you. It limits your freedom. But the park, we don't want the parks just for you. We want as many people as possible to come and enjoy. We want to have as many students as possible. That's the purpose of Torah. So it's true that we want you to be elite, but you know what? Sometimes you have to sacrifice it a little bit. We have to create fences around the Torah. The fences around the Torah is because we made a conscious decision to have as many people involved in Torah as possible, including the Am Haaretz. Again, with the parallel of the cliff. We want the whole world to see our parks. Well, if we want the whole world to see our parks, we have to create those fences, because otherwise people are going to get injured. If we only wanted the elite, so then we don't need the fences. If they're great rock climbers, they can do it on their own. And so that first statement in Pirkei Avot is, our goal is, yes, to have everyone elite, but we know that's not going to be the case, so we want as many people as possible to gain access to Torah. We have to create a fence around the Torah, because our goal is to have as many people as possible. right? If we didn't care about having as many people as possible, we didn't need the fence. So embedded in the whole concept of creating a fence around the Torah is this beautiful idea of increasing the number of people to have access to Torah. It may seem that a fence is built to keep people out. The whole reason why we have the fence actually is to bring as many people in, to give them accessibility. And when you create more and more chumras, more and more difficulties, more and more challenges that turn people off from Torah, so you've defeated the actual goal of the fence. The fence is to make it possible so more and more people can access the entire beauty. And part of the reasons why the rabbis decided along this path of increasing rather than decreasing, going for numbers, going for the am instead of the elite, that part of the goal of Jewish law is not to create, I would say, the creation of moral acts, but rather the creation of moral actors, of moral agents. Right? It's not just to get the right result, but we want people who think about how to get the right result. And if you want that, you need people to be engaged in the system. You can't simply hand it down from heavens. It's lo b'shamayim. You can't simply say, this is the law and follow it, and if you follow it, everything will be great. That's not what Torah law is about. Torah law is about, there is a law, but to make the law meaningful, you need to participate in it. And you need to actually be a moral agent, a halachic agent, and not just the recipient of a halachic decision. And to do that, therefore, it's counterintuitive, of course, is sometimes the rabbis have to create the fence around the Torah, but the fence is not to make the entrance fee higher, but rather to create more people able to enter in the first place. I thank you, those of you who stuck with me the whole time. We had a lot of interruptions. My apologies. And we'll see you again next week. And at some point in time, hopefully we'll see you in person as well. Stay tuned for that. All the best.